The door to the Redemption Creek Sheriff's office swung open at the first gray crack of dawn, and every man inside reached for his iron before he saw who had walked through it. Isaiah Sheridan stood in the doorway with his hands raised, his dark hat tipped back so there would be no mistake about his face, and the rising light caught the hollows of his cheekbones and the 3 days of beard that no wanted poster had ever quite managed to capture accurately. He was broader across the shoulder than the drawings suggested, calmer in the eyes, and there was something in the set of his jaw that Sheriff Amos Pruitt had never once seen on a man who walked into this office voluntarily. "I am coming in peaceable," Isaiah said. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that had once talked 3 armed men down from a robbery without a shot being fired, though no one in Redemption Creek knew that story. "I am surrendering myself to your custody, Sheriff, and I have one condition before you lock that cell." Pruitt was already on his feet, his hand still resting on the butt of his Colt Army revolver, his deputy Hector frozen against the back wall with his mouth hanging open. The reward dodger pinned above Pruitt's desk bore the name Isaiah Sheridan in bold black type, listed for train robbery, bank robbery, and obstruction of federal marshals, with a bounty of $1,200, dead or alive. "You do not get to name conditions," Pruitt said carefully, because something in the man's stillness told him to be careful. Isaiah lowered his hand slowly, reached into the breast pocket of his trail coat, and placed a folded piece of paper on the edge of the desk. "That is the land note on the Garner homestead, North Ridge, 420 acres. The bank in Harlan County holds it. The final payment is due today at noon or the land goes to auction. The reward money covers it with $60 to spare." He met the sheriff's eyes without blinking. "Louise Garner does not know I am here. She does not know what I am doing. And I need your word that the money goes to the bank before the auction gavel falls, not into your pocket or the county fund. Her land note, today, that is the only condition." Pruitt stared at the paper. He stared at the man. He thought about the 1.5 years he had spent trying to catch Isaiah Sheridan, about the 3 deputies who had ridden back empty-handed and slightly humiliated from that pursuit, and about the look that was currently on the face of the most wanted outlaw in the Harlan County territory, which was not the look of a man who had run out of options. It was the look of a man who had made a decision so final, so deliberate, that it had burned away every other feeling and left only a terrible, quiet clarity. "Lock him up, Hector," Pruitt said. He picked up the paper. "I will ride to the bank myself." And Isaiah Sheridan, who had outrun posses across 4 territories, who had never once been caught, who had slept under open skies for 3 years rather than surrender 1 inch of his freedom, walked into the cell and sat down on the cot as if he had finally come home to a place he had not known he was missing. He did not think about the trial that would follow, or the judge who would almost certainly reach for the harshest sentence the law allowed for a man with his sheet. He thought about a woman standing on the North Ridge in the early morning, watching the sun come up over 420 acres that were about to remain hers, and the thought was so complete, so full, that there was no room in it for regret. This is where the story of Isaiah Sheridan and Louise Garner truly begins, though it does not begin in that cell, and it does not begin in that dawn. It begins 14 months earlier, on a dirt road outside Redemption Creek, in the middle of a rainstorm that neither of them had seen coming. The summer of 1878 had been brutal across the Harlan County territory of West Texas. The Kishom Trail drives had slowed with the expanding rail lines. Small ranchers were being squeezed by the cattle combines moving in from the east, and the land banks were calling in notes with a frequency that made honest farmers feel like the law itself had been turned against them. Louise Garner had come to this country from Missouri 3 years prior, not as a bride and not as someone's dependent, which was unusual enough to make her a subject of daily conversation in Redemption Creek's one general store. She had come because her father, Thomas Garner, had staked 420 acres on the North Ridge in 1875, built a solid 2-room house, and then died of a fever in the spring of 1876 before he could make it into anything more than a promise. Louise had been 22 years old when she arrived to find a deed in probate, a land note with the Harlan County Territorial Bank, a house that needed a new roof, and 50 head of longhorn cattle that had mostly wandered into the canyon lands and needed rounding up. She stayed anyway, because leaving would have meant losing the only thing her father had ever managed to leave her, and losing it to a bank felt like a particular kind of defeat that she was not built to accept. By 1878, she was 25, lean and sun-browned and capable in a way that some men in town found admirable and others found deeply unsettling. She ran her herd of now 80 cattle with the help of one hired hand, a taciturn old Mexican cowboy named Celestino, who had worked the land since her father's time and who asked no questions about much of anything. She grew kitchen vegetables behind the house. She hauled her own water. She rode fence lines in weather that sent grown men indoors. And every 3 months she rode into Redemption Creek to make her note payment to the bank. The note had been her father's, at 8% interest on a principal of $600, and in 3 years of payments she had brought the balance down to just over $300. By her calculation, she had 2 payments left after the one due in the autumn of 1878, and then the land would be entirely hers, and no bank in the territory would be able to take it. She did not know, in the summer of 1878, that the Harlan County Territorial Bank had been bought by a land investment company out of Fort Worth called the Meridian Land Trust, and that the Meridian Land Trust had a practice of accelerating the final notes on small homesteads, declaring technical defaults on minor irregularities, and then acquiring the land at auction prices well below market value before reselling it to larger operators. She did not know that the man who ran the Meridian Land Trust's local acquisitions was a fastidious, cold-eyed banker named Edwin Coulter, who had already identified her 420 acres on the North Ridge as the key parcel in a much larger land consolidation scheme, because it sat between 2 creek-fed valleys, and whoever owned it controlled the water access for the entire northern range. She was riding back from town on the afternoon of an August rainstorm in 1878 when her horse threw a shoe on the muddy road and came up lame, and she was standing in the downpour trying to decide whether to walk 3 miles in the rain or wait under a cottonwood tree for the storm to pass when a rider came around the bend from the east. He slowed when he saw her, which told her he was not a man in a desperate hurry, though he clearly was a man who had been riding hard for some time. He was on a big gray gelding, the kind of horse that suggested either money or good horse thieving, and he was wearing a dark trail coat that the rain had soaked through. He pulled up and looked down at her horse's foot and then at her. "You need a hand with that animal," he said. It was not a question, and it was not delivered with the particular kind of condescension that she had learned to identify and resist. The tone that said a woman standing in the rain with a lame horse was a problem that needed a man to solve it for her. It was just an observation, and a practical one. "I need a farrier," she said. "What I have is a cottonwood tree and 3 miles of bad road." He swung down from the gray, tied it to a branch, and crouched to look at the hoof. He had the hands of someone who knew horses, careful and sure, and he worked the mud away from the foot to look at the shoe without being asked to. "She has not torn the hoof wall. The shoe is just pulled. She will be all right to walk slowly but not to carry weight for the distance." "I know that," Louise said. "I am trying to decide if the rain stops." He looked up at the sky, which was a solid gray wall from horizon to horizon, then back at her. "It does not stop for another 2 hours, I would estimate." She studied him for a moment, this stranger crouching in the mud of a Texas road in a rainstorm, who had the eyes of someone who spent a great deal of time watching the sky and the distance. "You have a good eye for weather," she said. "I have a necessary eye for weather," he said, which was not quite an explanation. "Louise Garner," she said, because her father had raised her to introduce herself first if she wanted to set the tone of a conversation. He straightened, and there was a brief hesitation before he said, Isaiah. Just the one name, which she noted but did not press on, because the territory was full of men who operated on first name only, and most of them had reasons she respected more than she resented. He ended up walking beside her the 3 miles back to her property, leading her lame mare while she led his gray, because the mathematics of 2 people and 2 horses in that situation were straightforward. They talked because 3 miles is a long way to walk in silence, and because both of them were, as it turned out, people who found silence comfortable but conversation more interesting. She told him about the ranch, about the cattle, about the land note and the 2 payments remaining, with the directness of someone who did not consider her circumstances shameful and therefore did not treat them as secrets. He told her very little about himself specifically, but he asked about her herd and her range with the detailed curiosity of someone who understood cattle country, and he spoke about the territory's water rights situation with an accuracy that suggested he had studied it or lived it. When they reached her gate, the rain had thinned to a gray drizzle, and the last light was failing behind the clouds. Celestino came out of the barn and took the mare without a word, looked at Isaiah the way he looked at everything new, with flat assessment and zero expression, and went back inside. I'm not going to offer you supper and a bed, Louise said, because she was a single woman living alone and the territory had enough gossip already without her adding to it. But I can offer you coffee and the dry of the barn for your horse. Coffee is welcome, Isaiah said. He sat across her kitchen table with a tin mug, and the lamp between them made the rain-dark look of him warmer and stranger at the same time, and she thought that he was the most watchful person she had ever shared a table with, in the sense that he was always aware of the door and the window without being obvious about it, the way a man learns to be when he has spent time in places where being caught off guard is expensive. She did not know yet what he was. She knew only that he was careful, and that careful men in West Texas in 1878 were careful for reasons, and that the reasons were not always ones she would agree with. But he had walked 3 miles in the rain beside a woman he had never met and asked nothing for it, and that counted for something that she could not quite name. He left before dark, which she appreciated, and he thanked her for the coffee with a gravity that suggested he meant it more than the simple words conveyed, and he rode east toward the canyon country on his big gray horse, and she stood in the doorway and watched him go and thought that she would probably not see him again, which was most likely for the best. She saw him again 12 days later. He came from the canyon side this time, mid-morning, riding the gray at a walk, and he had a piece of her fence line coiled over his saddle horn, a section of wire that had blown down in the previous week's wind and that she had not yet had time to rehang. I came across this on the east boundary, he said, pulling up at the yard gate. Thought you might want it returned before your cattle find the gap. She looked at the wire, then at him, then at the distance he must have ridden to bring it. Her east boundary was 2 miles from the canyon road. That was considerably out of your way, she said. I had time, he said. She found herself smiling, which was not something she did reflexively or without reason. Get down and help me hang it then, since you carried it all this way. They rode out to the break together, and she held the wire while he drove the staples with a fence mallet that he handled as naturally as the coffee mug 3 days prior, and they worked in the easy rhythm of 2 people who are both accustomed to physical labor and do not need to perform it for each other's benefit. When the fence was done, they sat their horses side by side on the ridge and looked out over her land, the long golden grass moving in the late summer wind, the cattle small and dark against it in the middle distance, the creek line marked by the cottonwoods in the low ground. It is good land, Isaiah said, and there was something in the way he said it, quiet and certain, as if he was measuring a value that had nothing to do with what the Harlan County Bank thought it was worth. It is the best land in this territory, Louise said, with the comfortable conviction of someone who has earned the right to that opinion through 3 years of hard work. My father knew it when he filed on it. He would be glad to know it is still ours. Isaiah was quiet for a moment. You are alone here, I have Celestino. That is not what I mean, she looked at him. The directness of the remark could have been offensive coming from someone else, but his tone was not challenging or pitying. It was the tone of someone stating a fact that concerns them, and she decided to answer it directly rather than defend against it. I know what you mean. I am alone here. I chose it. I am not sorry for the choice. I did not say you should be, he said. People usually say that next, she said. I am not usually people, he said, and she laughed before she could decide whether to. A clear laugh that surprised them both, and she saw something shift in his expression that she catalogued and thought about later, when the day was done and the house was quiet. He started coming by with a frequency that was carefully irregular, never predictable, always with a purpose that was practical on its surface. He had seen her creek dam needed a repair. He had tracked 3 of her cattle back into a canyon draw. He had information about a cattle buyer passing through who was offering fair prices. Celestino watched all of this from the barn or the fence with his flat assessment face, and said nothing until the 3rd week when he told her, without looking up from the harness he was mending, that the man rode like he was always ready to leave fast, which was not a criticism. Celestino clarified, just a thing worth knowing. Louise already knew it. She had begun to piece together who Isaiah Sheridan was the way you piece together a picture from fragments, not all at once, but in accumulated details that finally form an unmistakable shape. The way he never entered town. The way he always knew which direction trouble would come from. The way he had appeared in the territory without a prior history that anyone she quietly asked could account for. The way he handled a firearm, which she had seen once when a rattler came up fast near her yard gate, and he had drawn and fired with a speed and economy that was not the action of a man who had learned to shoot recreationally. She went into town one afternoon and looked at the reward Dodgers pinned in the sheriff's office window, not because she expected to see him there, but because she needed to know. And she saw the face looking back at her from the paper, rougher in the drawing than in life, and the name Isaiah Sheridan, and the list of charges, and the figure of $800, which had not yet been raised to the $1,200 it would eventually become. She stood on the boardwalk outside the sheriff's office for a long time. She thought about the fence wire he had carried 2 miles out of his way. She thought about the way he listened when she talked about the land, genuinely, with the attention of someone who understood that a thing could matter beyond its financial value. She thought about the time last week when old Celestino had been sick with a stomach ailment for 3 days, and Isaiah had appeared without being asked, and helped her move 60 cattle to the upper pasture in the August heat, and then refused any payment and eaten a bowl of her stew at the outdoor table, and talked to her about the water rights case that was moving through the territorial courts, and what it might mean for small landowners. And she had sat across from him in the evening light, and felt something she had not felt in years, which was the sense of not being entirely alone in the work of staying alive and holding on. She thought about all of this and she went home, and the next time Isaiah came by she told him without preamble, "I looked you up in the sheriff's window." He had been about to dismount. He went still on the horse instead, and something moved across his face that was not quite guilt and not quite relief and was entirely its own thing. "And," he said, "and you are not what those papers say you are," she said, "or you are not only that. And I am not going to pretend I did not look. And I am not going to pretend I think the law in this territory is always applied to the people who deserve it most. But I need to know who you actually are if you are going to keep coming here." He got down from the horse then and tied it to the gate post, and he told her. He told her all of it, or enough of it that the shape was clear and honest. He had grown up in Missouri, same as she had in a county further south, the youngest of 4 brothers. His oldest brother had been the first to go outside the law, running whiskey during the dry county years, and Isaiah had followed him the way youngest brothers follow, without enough wisdom to see where the road ended. The train robbery that the wanted poster led with had been his brother's operation, and Isaiah had been 20 years old, and had not understood that a job that involved armed men on a moving train was not the same category as moving untaxed whiskey across a county line. His brother had been killed in that robbery, shot by a railroad guard. Isaiah had escaped into the territory and had kept running partly because he was afraid and partly because no one had told him that stopping was still an option. The subsequent charges had accumulated in the way that charges do when a man is already wanted, and therefore a convenient name to put on any unsolved crime in a jurisdiction, and he had long since passed the point where the legal picture matched the moral one. He told her this standing by her gate in the late afternoon, and when he was done, he said, "I am not asking you to decide anything about that. I came here because I wanted to be near the kind of life you have, because it reminded me of what a life is supposed to look like, and I should have been more honest about what I was from the beginning." She looked at him for a long time. The sun was going behind the ridge and the shadow of the cottonwood was long across the yard. "Are you planning to rob anyone in this county?" she asked. "No," he said. "Are you going to bring trouble to my gate?" "I am trying not to," he said, "though I cannot promise you circumstances." "Nobody can promise anybody circumstances," she said, which was as much a philosophy as a response. "Get in and have supper." That was the night everything changed, though neither of them spoke about what was changing, because they were both people who preferred to let things declare themselves honestly rather than forcing names onto them prematurely. They ate her stew at the indoor table because the evening had gone cool, and he told her about his brother with a grief that was old but not finished, and she told him about her father with the same quality of loss. And by the time the lamp burned low, they were sitting in the comfortable proximity of two people who have stopped calculating the distance between themselves and started simply being in the same place. He rode out late and she stood in the doorway, and this time she did not think that she probably would not see him again, because she knew she would, and she knew that she wanted to, and she was honest enough with herself to know what that meant. The autumn came in fast and golden across the North Ridge, and with it came Edwin Coulter. She had gone to the bank in September to make her penultimate payment, the second to last on the note, the one that brought the balance down to a final $312, and the man at the counter had been someone she did not recognize. A city-dressed man with a waxed mustache and a manner that was precisely polite in the way of someone who has practiced precision in the place of warmth. He had introduced himself as Edwin Coulter, new Director of Land Acquisitions for the Harlan County Territorial Bank, now operating as a subsidiary of the Meridian Land Trust, a fact that he conveyed as if it were entirely good news for everyone involved. He accepted her payment with a receipt, and then informed her, in that same carefully pleasant tone, that the Meridian Land Trust had completed a review of the existing note portfolio, and had determined that the Garner land note contained a technical irregularity in its original filing, specifically that the property survey on record did not match the current territorial survey standards implemented in the Land Reform Act of 1877, and that the bank would therefore be requiring a full survey certification before the final payment could be applied, the cost of which would be borne by the note holder, one Miss Louise Garner. She asked what the survey certification cost. He told her it was typically $400, though the bank would be willing to accept a reduced settlement on the note if she preferred to simply sell the property back to the trust at current assessed value, which he was prepared to offer that very day. She asked what the assessed value was. He named a figure that was less than half what the land was worth by any reasonable measure, and she looked at him across the polished counter of the bank that was no longer the bank she had always brought her payments to, and she understood, with the particular clarity of someone who has spent 3 years learning to read the terrain, exactly what was happening. "I will get the survey," she said, and walked out. She told Isaiah that evening, sitting on the porch in the cooling air, the cattle quiet in the home pasture, Celestino's lamp burning in the bunkhouse window. She told it straight without dramatizing it, and when she was done, he was quiet for a moment in the particular way she had come to understand meant he was thinking something he was deciding whether to say. "That is not legal," he said. "The 1877 Act grandfathered existing notes. Coulter knows that. He is counting on you not knowing it. Can I prove it? With the right lawyer, yes. The territorial court records are public. But that takes time and money, and I suspect Coulter knows the timeline on your note better than you do and has arranged things so you do not have enough of either." She looked out at her land in the evening dark. "How much time do I have? When is the final payment due?" "The 1st of November. He was quiet again. She had learned by now to let the quiet work, not to fill it. "There are ways to get the money," he said carefully. "Not the ways you are thinking," she said, which was not an accusation, just a fact, and he heard it as she intended it. "No," he agreed, "not those ways." She did not sleep well that autumn. She went into town and consulted the only lawyer in Redemption Creek, a man named Hartwell, who confirmed Isaiah's reading of the law but told her bluntly that making the legal argument would take 6 to 8 months, and Coulter would almost certainly have the land at auction before the case was heard. She wrote to a cousin in Missouri who had some legal knowledge and who wrote back with sympathy, but without practical help. She counted her savings, added her cattle income, added everything she could think of, and came up short by $240, which was a gap that might as well have been 1,000. Isaiah came by nearly every day now, and they did not talk about the money problem every time, because there were only so many ways to describe an impossible situation, and repeating them did not improve it. They talked about other things, the territorial politics that were reshaping the land ownership patterns of West Texas, the small things of daily ranch life, the stories from her Missouri childhood and his, the way the light hit the North Ridge at different hours and different seasons. They talked the way people talk when they are building something together, without yet having named the thing they are building. One evening in early October, when the air had gone sharp and the stars were very bright and they were sitting on the porch steps close enough that their shoulders were nearly touching, she said, without quite looking at him, "I am grateful you are here." He was quiet for a moment. "I am grateful to have somewhere to be," he said, and it was so simply and honestly said that she turned to look at him, and found him already looking at her, and neither of them looked away, and the distance between them that had never quite been calculated was suddenly 0, and he kissed her with the tentative care of a man who is aware that he is holding something very important and does not want to do it wrong. She kissed him back with the straightforward conviction of a woman who, when she decides a thing, decides it completely. It was after that, sitting in the warm dark of the porch, that he said, quietly, that he was going to find a way to fix the money problem. And she said, with equal quietness, that she did not want him to fix it with anything that would bring trouble back to them. And he said he understood that, and she said she meant it seriously, and he said he knew she did. And they sat there in the star-sharp October air, and neither of them said the thing that was underneath that conversation, which was that the word "them" had appeared in it naturally and without announcement, and that both of them had noticed. October passed in a strange, suspended quality, half joy and half dread, the land golden and beautiful and under threat at the same time, and Isaiah there every day now, not staying the night, not yet, because he was careful of her reputation in a community where she needed to be taken seriously, but present in every other sense, working alongside her and Celestino, talking and laughing, and sometimes just being in the same space in that way that two people have when they have stopped needing to perform for each other and can simply exist. Celestino, who never said much about anything, said one morning, hammering fence posts, "That man would walk through fire for you, Miss Garner." He said it with his eyes on the post, not on her. She did not answer because she did not need to, because she knew it, and knowing it was the most frightening and the most beautiful thing that had happened to her in several years. The last week of October brought two things nearly simultaneously. The first was a letter from the Meridian Land Trust, delivered via the sheriff's office, informing her that the bank had determined her note was in technical default due to the survey irregularity, and that the final balance of $312 was now due in full by November 1st, or the property would be placed at auction on November 2nd, with Edwin Coulter listed as the presiding officer of the sale. The second was a new wanted poster for Isaiah Sheridan, $1,200, following an incident in the next county that she had not asked about and he had not explained, though she knew by the timing of when he had been absent that the details were not good. She showed him the letter when he came that evening. She did not show him the poster because she knew he already knew. He read the letter twice, folded it carefully, set it on the table. "How much are you short?" he asked. $240 for the note plus whatever the survey costs, which Coulter will make as high as he can. $240, he said. "Isaiah," she said, and when he looked up she held his eyes. "I mean what I said before." "I know," he said. "I need you to promise me." He was quiet in the way that meant he was choosing his next words very carefully. "I am not going to do anything that brings lawmen to your door," he said. "I promise you that." It was a slightly different promise from the one she had asked for, and she heard the difference, but she could see in his face that it was the truest one he could make, and she accepted it as such. She went to bed that night and did not sleep for a long time, lying in the dark of the house her father had built, listening to the wind in the cottonwoods, thinking about 420 acres and what it meant that she might lose them, thinking about Isaiah and what it meant that she might lose him too, though in a different and perhaps worse way, and feeling for the first time in 3 years the thing she had worked very hard to prevent feeling, which was the sense that the forces aligned against her were larger than what she could match alone. She did not know, in that sleepless night, what Isaiah was doing. He had ridden north, to the canyon country, where he had kept a small stash of money from 2 years ago, a legitimate amount, wages from a brief period of honest work that he had never spent because, in the life he lived, you learned to keep a reserve. It was $140, in a tin box under a flat rock in a canyon draw that he had described to no one. He counted it by lantern light and knew it was not enough, and then he sat in the canyon dark for a long time, thinking about a woman who had told him not to do the thing that was the most obvious solution, and who was right to tell him, and who deserved to be listened to. He thought about the nature of the trap he was in. He was a man with a price on his head that increased every month, who was in love with a woman who would lose everything she had built if he was not able to help her, who had promised her not to bring trouble to her door, and whose only reliable resources were things she had specifically asked him not to use. He thought about this for a long time, and then he thought about the fact that his presence in her life, while it was the best thing in his life, was also the most dangerous thing in hers. If the law found him at her ranch, she would be implicated. If Coulter found out who she was associated with, he would use it. Every day Isaiah stayed near her was another day the risk compounded. He thought about all of this, and he understood clearly, with the terrible clarity that sometimes comes in the middle of the night in a canyon, that the only move that solved every problem was the one he had the most reason not to make. He rode back at midnight, past her dark house, past the lampless bunkhouse, past the sleeping cattle. He sat his horse on the ridge for a while and looked at the land in the moonlight, the same land he had looked at with her 2 months ago when he had said it was good land, and meant it with his whole body and not just his mouth. He thought about who he was and what he had done with the last 3 years, and whether any of it was worth the paper the reward posters were printed on, and he thought about Louise Garner telling him clearly that she was grateful he was there, and the way she had looked at him when she said it, and the straightforward completeness with which she had kissed him on the porch steps. He thought about all the things that completeness could mean if a man were in a position to receive it honestly. And he thought about the fact that he was not currently in that position, and that there was one way to change it. He did not go to her door that night. He rode back to the canyon, and he sat with his decision until it became more real than the alternatives, and then he began to prepare. He wrote a letter, which took him 2 attempts because he was not a poor writer, but he wanted to get this one exactly right. He addressed it to Louise Garner, North Ridge Ranch, Harlan County. He told her that he had gone to the sheriff's office of his own will. He told her the reward money was to go to the bank to pay the land note before the auction on November 2nd. He told her the land was good, and she had built something worth having, and he was glad he had seen it. He told her that he was sorry for every piece of it except meeting her, and that meeting her was the truest thing that had happened to him in longer than he could account for. He gave the letter to a boy in town to deliver after dawn. He walked into the sheriff's office at first light on November 1st, 1878, and he kept his hands raised, and he put the land note document on the desk, and he said the words, and Sheriff Pruitt, to his credit, looked at the situation long enough to understand its dimensions, and rode to the bank before noon. The land note on the Garner homestead, North Ridge, Harlan County, was paid in full at 11:43 in the morning of November 1st, 1878, 1 hour and 17 minutes before the auction was scheduled to begin. Louise received the letter at 9 in the morning. She read it at the kitchen table, and Celestino found her there an hour later, still at the table, the letter in her hands, not moving. He looked at it and at her and said nothing, which was the most appropriate thing he could have done. She rode into town at a pace that alarmed Celestino sufficiently that he saddled his own horse and followed at a respectful distance. She went straight to the sheriff's office and pushed through the door, and Sheriff Pruitt was just coming back from the bank and almost walked into her on the boardwalk, and he said, "Miss Garner," with an expression that contained several things at once, and she said, "Where is he?" with the contained ferocity of a woman who has made a decision and is implementing it. "In the cell, miss, and before you say anything, I want you to know that I sent the money to the bank as he asked. I gave him my word, and your note is paid." She stopped. The information landed on her, and she let it sit for a moment because it needed a moment. Her land note was paid. The ranch was hers entirely and finally, with no bank holding the difference. She felt this fact, felt it fully, and then she set it aside and said, "I need to see him." Pruitt stepped back from the door. He was a decent man, Amos Pruitt, and he had been a lawman long enough to know when a situation had dimensions that the law could not fully account for. "5 minutes," he said, "and Hector stays in the room." She went in. Isaiah was sitting on the edge of the cot, and when he saw her come through the door, his face did the thing that she had seen it do on the porch steps in October, the thing that was not quite surprise and not quite relief, that was its own thing entirely. "You had no right," she said, and her voice was steady in the way that things are steady under very high pressure. "I know," he said. "You had no right to do this without telling me, to make a decision this large about your own life without." She stopped. She was shaking very slightly, which she was aware of and disliked. "Isaiah, Louise," he said, "you are in a cell. I am aware. What is going to happen to you?" He was quiet for a moment. "There will be a trial. The charges are real mostly. A good lawyer could argue some of them down. I was never the principal in any of the larger operations, and there are witnesses who will say so if someone asks the right questions." He said this with the calm of someone who has already done the accounting. "I am not going to hang if that is what you are asking." She sat down on the bench against the wall, which was as far from the cell bars as the room allowed, and looked at him. "You were going to leave," she said, "before this, eventually, because staying was becoming too dangerous." He did not deny it. "I was trying to figure out how to do it in a way that did not hurt you." "You leaving would have hurt me," she said plainly. "This hurts me in a different direction. I would like to know which of these hurts you considered acceptable when you sat in that canyon and made this decision." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I thought about you losing the land. I thought about what that would do to you. And then I thought about you with the land after building the rest of what you are building, and I thought that was the version of the story where you were all right. And the other one was the version where you were not. And you in prison," she said. "I have been outside the law for 3 years," he said. "This is the first thing I have done in 3 years that was not that." She looked at him for a long time. Hector was deeply uncomfortable against the far wall and was working hard to be invisible. "When is the trial?" she said. "Prout says the circuit judge comes through in January." "January," she said. 2.5 months, he said. She stood up. She crossed to the cell, which was closer than Hector thought she was going to get, and she put her hands through the bars and held the bars, not dramatically, just firmly, the way she held everything, and she said, quietly enough that Hector could not hear it, "I am going to hire you a lawyer. I am going to talk to every witness who can say what you actually did and did not do. And I am going to be in that courtroom in January, and when you come out of it, we are going to have a conversation about the rest of your life that is not in a cell and not on a porch and not in any uncertain middle ground." He looked at her. He looked at her the way a man looks at something when he is finally understanding the full size of it. "Louise," he said. "That is my name," she said. "I will be back tomorrow." She kept her word. She came every day for the 2.5 months of January, sometimes with legal documents, sometimes with food that was better than what the county provided, always with the same quality of focused, unshakable presence that she brought to everything she cared about. She hired a lawyer named Ashworth from Fort Worth, recommended to her by a land rights advocate she had written to after the Coulter situation, and Ashworth was good, the kind of good that comes from genuinely liking an underdog case. Edwin Coulter, meanwhile, had not given up. The loss of the Garner land note had disrupted his land consolidation plan significantly, and he was a man who dealt poorly with disruption. He made several moves in November and December that Louise documented carefully, including an attempt to challenge the note payment on the grounds that it had been made with proceeds from criminal activity, an argument that Ashworth dismantled with precision and evident enjoyment by pointing out that the reward money was a legal payment from public funds for services to law enforcement, and that its application to a legitimate debt was entirely proper. Coulter also tried to have Louise's property reassessed for tax purposes at a value that would make the taxes unaffordable, which was a maneuver she recognized immediately, and countered by filing a complaint with the Territorial Land Office that resulted, eventually, in a formal inquiry into the Meridian Land Trust's practices in Harlan County, an inquiry that would, in the following 2 years, result in the return of several properties that had been wrongly acquired. Louise was the first to file in the anchor case, and the territorial land lawyer who handled it told her, without exaggeration, that without her detailed documentation, it would have been much harder to build. She did all of this while riding back and forth to town, managing her cattle, keeping the ranch running, and visiting the county jail every single day. Celestino, who had now decided that he fully approved of the situation without ever quite saying so explicitly, ran the ranch with more authority and evident satisfaction than he had in 3 years. The trial came in January 1879, 2.5 months after Isaiah had walked into the sheriff's office. Ashworth had done his work carefully. He had located 2 witnesses who had been present at the train robbery of 1875, both of whom confirmed that Isaiah had been 19, had not fired a weapon, and had been following his brother without understanding the full nature of the operation. He had documented the pattern of charge accumulation in the subsequent years and argued credibly that a significant portion of it represented the common territorial practice of attaching a known name to unresolved crimes, which was accurate, and which the judge, a man named Beaumont who had seen this pattern before, received with visible recognition. Louise sat in the front row of the courthouse every day of the 3-day trial. She wore her good dress, the dark green one she saved for town, and she sat straight-backed and attentive, and she did not look away from the proceedings or from Isaiah when he looked at her, which was often enough that Ashworth had to quietly tell him to keep his eyes on the judge. On the 3rd day, Judge Beaumont sentenced Isaiah Sheridan to 18 months in the territorial prison at Huntsville for his confirmed role in the 1875 train robbery, with credit for time already served and a recommendation for early release upon evidence of good conduct. The remaining charges were either dropped or formally reduced to misdemeanor status. The sentence was less than Pruitt had expected and considerably less than what Coulter, who attended every day of the trial with an expression of cold anticipation, had been hoping for. Isaiah heard the sentence with his eyes on the judge, then looked at Louise, and she nodded once, the clean, brief nod of someone who is acknowledging a result they have been working toward and who is already thinking about the next thing. 18 months. Credit for the time from November. He would be out by the following spring at the earliest, possibly before that. She visited him at Huntsville as often as the regulations allowed, which was once a month, a day's ride each way. She wrote to him every week. She told him about the cattle and the land and Celestino and the progress of the case against the Meridian Land Trust, and he wrote back about the people he had met and what he had learned about himself in the still, enforced quiet of confinement, which was more than he had expected and different from what he had feared. He wrote in February a letter that began with practical news and ended with the sentence, "I think about the porch steps every day and about what you said through the cell bars and about the word rest and how long I have wanted the rest of something without knowing what to call it." She wrote back, "The land will still be here. I will still be here. Take the time you have and use it honestly, because you are going to come out of it into something you deserve, and I need you to believe that." He was released in October of 1879, 11 months after his surrender, on the early release recommendation, having served with the conduct that was entirely consistent with who he actually was as opposed to what the wanted posters had suggested. Louise drove the wagon to Huntsville herself. She left Celestino in charge of the ranch, and she drove the better part of a day to be outside the gate when it opened on the morning of October 15th, 1879, and when Isaiah Sheridan walked out of Huntsville prison in the early autumn sunlight, thinner than she remembered and more serious in the eyes, she was leaning against the wagon with her arms crossed and the morning behind her, and they looked at each other across 15 yards of Texas dirt road. He walked to her, and she uncrossed her arms, and they met in the middle in the way of two people who have kept a particular distance for an insufficient reason and have mutually decided to stop. He held her for a long time. She let herself be held, which was an act of will for a woman who had spent 3 years not needing to be, and found that it was not weakness at all, that it felt like the most natural thing in the world, like coming to the end of a very long fence line, and finding the corner post exactly where the survey said it would be. "I have been thinking," he said, into her hair, "about what I want the rest of my life to look like." "Tell me on the way home," she said, and she meant home, both of theirs, because that was the conversation she had promised, and they had both known for some time where it was pointing. They were married in Redemption Creek in December of 1879, in the small Methodist church that was the only church in town, with Celestino as witness, and a collection of townspeople who had followed the entire story of the land note, and the surrender, and the trial with the intense interest that small towns bring to narratives that contain real stakes. Pruitt attended, which surprised some people, and surprised no one who understood the dimensions of the situation. Ashworth sent a telegram from Fort Worth with congratulations, and a note that the Meridian Land Trust inquiry was proceeding excellently. Louise wore the dark green dress again, and a borrowed veil that belonged to the minister's wife, and Isaiah wore a new suit that he had bought with the first money he had earned legally in the territory, which was wages from a 3-month stint breaking horses for a rancher 2 counties over who had hired him on Ashworth's recommendation. He stood at the front of the church and watched her come down the aisle with the same quality of attention he brought to every distance, except that this time the distance was closing, and he was glad of it. The minister was a straightforward man who said the words clearly, and with feeling, and moved through the ceremony at a pace that suggested he understood they were both people who meant business. When he reached the part about the vows, Isaiah said his with the quiet certainty that had characterized every important thing he had ever said, and Louise said hers with the same direct completeness that had characterized everything she had ever decided. They were not different people in a church from who they were at a kitchen table, or on a porch step, or on a ridge looking out over 420 acres. They were exactly themselves, which was, the minister reflected afterward, the best thing you could say about a couple. After the ceremony, there was a small gathering at the ranch, where Celestino had built a fire in the yard, and several of the neighboring ranch families came by with food and congratulations, and the general warmth of a community that is glad to see something good settle into permanence. Even old Prout stayed for an hour and had coffee and told Isaiah, with the gruffness of a man who is not accustomed to managing the softer complexities of human experience, that he had handled a bad situation as well as it could be handled, and Isaiah said he appreciated that, and they shook hands with the gravity of two men who understand that the law and the person are sometimes in a different relationship from what the paperwork suggests. The winter of 1879 and 1880 passed in the particular warmth of a life that has settled into itself after a period of uncertainty. They worked the ranch together, Isaiah bringing skills that complemented what Louise had built, a knowledge of cattle country and water patterns, and the larger territorial economics that made the ranch more efficient and its future more secure. He had a stillness about him that was useful in practical ways, in the patience required for the long tasks of ranch work, and he had a humor that she had known was in him, but that had more room to come out now that neither of them was carrying the weight of hidden circumstances. They argued occasionally and productively, the way people do when they both have strong opinions and enough respect for each other to express them, and they always came back to the same place, which was the recognition that they were better at this together than apart, and that the together was the point. In the spring of 1880, the territorial land inquiry delivered its first results, and the Garner Ranch was formally recognized as the anchor case in a legal action that resulted in the Meridian Land Trust being required to return 3 improperly acquired properties in Harlan County, and to pay restitution to 4 additional landowners whose notes had been manipulated. Edwin Coulter resigned his position and left the territory, which suited everyone in Redemption Creek considerably. The land advocate who had helped Louise with the inquiry wrote to her personally to say that her documentation and persistence had made the case, and to ask if she would be willing to speak at a territorial land rights meeting in Austin in the autumn. She went, and Isaiah went with her, and she spoke with the clarity and authority of someone who has lived the problem she is describing, and 3 other small landowners told her afterward that they were going to file complaints based on what she had described. Celestino, when they came back from Austin, had the home pasture fence repaired, the cattle in excellent condition, and a new leather-bound ledger for the ranch accounts that he presented to Louise without comment as a welcome home gift, because he expressed affection exclusively through practical acts, and she understood this perfectly. In the autumn of 1880, Louise told Isaiah, at the kitchen table over the morning coffee that had become the fixed ritual of their days, that she was expecting a child. She said it in the same direct way she said everything, watching him across the table with the calm of a woman who has already made her peace with the enormity of a piece of news. He put down his mug and he looked at her, and then he did something she had not seen him do before, which was to smile with his whole face, not the contained half-expression she had learned to read, but something open and bright and undisguised. He reached across the table and took her hand. "Are you well?" he asked. "Entirely," she said. "And you?" He laughed, which was the other thing she had not often seen him do fully. "Ask me again once I have had a moment to locate myself," he said, and she laughed with him. Their son was born in May of 1881, after a labor that was hard and long and managed by the practical, competent hands of the midwife who served the Northridge families, a woman named Mrs. Colquhoun, who had delivered approximately 40 children in her career and had the confidence of long experience. He was a healthy, loud, definite baby boy who arrived in the world with an evident intention to occupy all of it. And when Mrs. Colquhoun placed him in Isaiah's arms for the first time, the expression on Isaiah Sheridan's face was the most unguarded thing anyone in that room had ever seen on a person. They named him Thomas, for her father, with Isaiah as his middle name after the grandfather he would not know. And Thomas Isaiah Sheridan began his life in the house on the North Ridge with the same quality of determined, intentional existence that characterized both of his parents. Celestino took one look at the baby and declared him satisfactory, which from Celestino was high praise, and presented him with a small carved wooden horse that took Louise a moment to realize Celestino had made himself, in the evenings, over the preceding weeks. She thanked him with a directness that matched his own, and he nodded and went back to the barn. The ranch grew steadily through 1881 and 1882. Isaiah had a particular gift for assessing cattle quality that made their buying and selling decisions consistently profitable, and Louise had the administrative tenacity to keep the books balanced and the improvements prioritized intelligently, so that they expanded their herd carefully and repaired and improved the buildings and fencing in a sequence that made each investment support the next. They hired a second hand in 1882, a young man named Rupert who was 18 and eager, and who learned ranch work with the same enthusiasm that Thomas learned to walk, which is to say fast and with a high tolerance for falling down. In 1882, Isaiah rode into Redemption Creek to renew the ranch's water rights registration at the Territorial Land Office, which had been reorganized as a result of the reforms that the Meridian Land Trust inquiry had helped accelerate. And the land officer told him, in a tone that suggested he had been waiting for the right moment, that the remaining misdemeanor notations on Isaiah's record had been formally expunged by the Territorial Court in Fort Worth, as part of a review of cases that had been affected by the unethical practices of the county's former law enforcement, which had included accepting payments from the Meridian Land Trust to facilitate property seizures. Isaiah came home and told Louise at the kitchen table, same as she had told him about Thomas, and she sat with it for a moment in the same way he had, understanding its dimensions, and then she said, "You are a free man." "I have been a free man for a while now," he said. "This is just the paper version," she smiled. "The paper version matters in this territory." "It does," he admitted. "It matters quite a bit." They were both quiet for a moment, the kitchen warm with the mid-morning light coming in through the window she had replaced with proper glass in 1881, Thomas asleep in the next room, the ranch around them in the particular piece of a working day in a well-run place. "I want to expand the south pasture," she said, which was where her mind went when it resolved something, immediately to the next thing. "I know," he said. "I have been thinking about the water access. If we extend the irrigation channel from the lower creek, the south pasture becomes viable for hay. Rupert can start on it in the spring," she said. "We will need to hire another hand by then if Thomas keeps growing at this rate," he said, because Thomas at 1 year old was the most determined small person either of them had ever encountered, and showed every sign of being someone who would find productive work long before he was of an age to legally be assigned it. She laughed, and the sound of it went out through the kitchen window into the bright Texas morning, and Isaiah sat across from her and felt the completeness of that moment, the accumulated rightness of it, in a way that took his breath in a clean and pleasant way, the way good air does at altitude. 3 years running. 3 years of sleeping under open skies and never quite being able to stop moving. And now this. A woman laughing in the morning light of a kitchen they both owned, in a house on land that was theirs entirely and legally and finally, with a son sleeping in the next room and a ranch around them that they had built into something real. He thought about the canyon where he had made his decision, the flat rock under the cold stars, the $140 that was not enough. He thought about the sheriff's office at dawn, his hands raised in the gray light. He thought about the letter he had given to the boy to deliver after sunrise, and whether he had found the right words or only the truest ones, which are sometimes the same thing and sometimes not. He thought these things briefly and then released them, because they belonged to a different life, one that had ended in the best possible way, which is not in defeat but in transformation. In 1883, when Thomas was 2 and fully mobile and deeply interested in the horses and the cattle and everything that Celestino did in the barn, Louise told Isaiah at the kitchen table again, same time, same morning coffee, same direct watching look across the table. Again, he said, and she saw the same bright, unguarded smile appear. Again, she confirmed. Their daughter was born in the early winter of 1883, in December, in a snowfall that was unusual for the Harlan County territory, but that the midwife handled with practiced calm. She was smaller than Thomas had been at birth and quieter, and she looked at the world from her first moments with large dark eyes that had Isaiah's quality of taking everything in and processing it carefully before responding. They named her Clara, for no particular history, but because it suited her, and she became within weeks the object of Thomas's cautious, protective older brother attention, which expressed itself primarily as standing near her and reporting on her status to any available adult. Celestino produced another carved horse for Clara, which he delivered with the same economy of ceremony as the first, and which Louise received with the same warm directness, and she noted that the carving was a little more detailed than Thomas's had been, which she thought was perhaps Celestino's version of a compliment on continued quality. By 1884, the Sheridan Ranch on the North Ridge was a stable and productive operation. They ran 140 cattle, an increase from the 80 Louise had managed alone, with 420 acres properly fenced and watered, and a hay production capability from the South Pasture expansion that meant they no longer had to buy feed in dry summers. They had 2 full-time hands now, Rupert having been joined by a steady older cowboy named Graham who had come from the north with good references, and a habit of reading in the evenings that Thomas found endlessly interesting. Isaiah had developed a reputation in the territory as someone worth consulting on cattle buying decisions, not formally, but in the way that knowledge becomes known in communities that depend on practical expertise, and he sometimes rode out to neighboring ranches to give opinions that were always honest and usually right. Louise had continued her involvement in land rights advocacy, corresponding regularly with the territorial office in Austin, and contributing to the developing body of case documentation that was slowly making the kind of manipulation the Meridian Land Trust had practiced more difficult and more visible. Prout retired from the sheriff's office in 1884, and his replacement, a younger man from Abilene named Castellan, came out to the ranch on his first circuit of the district properties and introduced himself with the respectful formality of someone who had been told the history and understood its relevance. He and Isaiah shook hands on the porch, and Castellan accepted coffee at the kitchen table, and Thomas sat on the bench beside his father and regarded the new sheriff with the same careful assessment that ran in both sides of his family. And when Castellan left, Thomas said to his father, "He has a good horse," which was, at 3 years old, his primary criterion for character assessment. "He does," Isaiah agreed. "I want a horse," Thomas said. "In 2 years," Isaiah said. "That is a long time." "Some things are worth a long time," his father said, and the remark was true in more directions than the literal one, and Louise, who heard it from the doorway, smiled and went back inside. In 1885, Celestino told Louise on a quiet afternoon in October that he was going to retire to San Antonio, where his sister lived, and where the winters were easier on his joints. He said this with the same flat-effect directness with which he said everything, and she sat with it for a moment the way she sat with important things, and then she said she was going to miss him very much, and that he had been the constant of this place through all its changes, and that whatever the ranch had become, he was part of the foundation of it. He received this with the same nod he gave to most things, and then he said, "It is a good ranch. I am glad I stayed to see it right." And that was the most he said, and it was enough. They gave him a proper leaving, with a dinner and the good coffee, and a payment that was more than he had asked for, because he had never asked for much and had always given more than he had asked for. He rode out on a November morning, south toward San Antonio, and Thomas watched him go from the fence post where he had been given official permission to sit unsupervised, and said, without being told, "He will miss the horses." "He will," Louise said beside him. "I will miss him," Thomas said. "So will I," his father said on his other side. They hired Rupert on as full-time foreman, which was the right call for all the obvious reasons, and the ranch continued. The summer of 1886 brought a drought across the Harlan County territory that tested every operation in the region, small and large alike. The Sheridan Ranch had the advantage of the creek-fed irrigation system that Isaiah had extended in 1882, which kept the hay production sufficient through the worst of it. But the summer was hard work and constant management, with Isaiah and Rupert riding the range every day, and Louise running the water schedule with the same focused intensity she brought to the land rights work, measuring and calculating and adjusting. They came through it without losing any cattle, which was not something every ranch in the territory could say, and the effort of it had a quality that was strenuous and shared and ultimately affirming, because going through a hard thing together has that quality of showing you to each other in conditions that reveal what is actually there. And what was actually there, between Isaiah Sheridan and Louise Garner Sheridan, in the summer of 1886, was exactly what had always been there. Two people who were better at every hard thing, because the other one was in it with them. In the fall of 1886, when the drought broke and the rains came back in a long relieving pour that Thomas and Clara ran out into the yard to experience directly and without clothing, which they were retrieved from with the patient authority that parenting requires, Louise told Isaiah at the kitchen table, same time, same morning coffee. "Is this becoming a tradition?" he asked. "A very good one," she said. Their third child, a second son, was born in April of 1887, and they named him Samuel Celestino Sheridan, the second name for the man who had been the faithful constant of the place before it became what it was. When they wrote to tell Celestino this, his reply was the shortest letter either of them had ever received, 4 words. "Thank you. Very fine." They framed it. By 1888, the Sheridan Ranch on the North Ridge was 10 years old in Louise's keeping and 3 years into its current form as something jointly and permanently built. Thomas was 7, Clara was 4, and Samuel was 1, and the kitchen table that had been the site of every major conversation between Isaiah and Louise was large enough now to need the extension leaf that Louise had added to the original furniture when Thomas started requiring a high chair and showed no signs of returning to infancy. The territory of Texas was changing around them, as it had been changing since Louise arrived in 1875. The last of the open-range cattle drives were giving way to the fenced-range operations that the barbed wire revolution had enabled, and the small landowners who had survived the bank manipulation era and the drought years were becoming the stable middle layer of a landscape that was slowly moving from frontier to settled country. It was not entirely good, this settling, because what it settled included some injustices alongside the legitimate growth, but Louise's decade of land rights work had left her with a clear enough view of the terrain and enough connections in the territorial offices to continue being useful in it. She was 35 in 1888, and she was the woman the younger landowners in the district came to when they had questions about their notes and their rights, which she answered with the same directness and thorough knowledge she had acquired through experience and made better through documentation. Isaiah was 32, and he was the man the ranchers came to about cattle, and the two of them together were a resource that the community of the North Ridge had come to value in the specific way that communities value people who are genuinely competent and genuinely present. On a Sunday evening in the spring of 1888, with Thomas doing his letters at the big table and Clara asleep in the chair, she always fell asleep when she intended to stay up, and Samuel already down in the small room that had been built as an addition to the east side of the house in 1885, and the ranch settled into the peaceful quiet of a day that had been full and was now resting. Isaiah came in from the porch where he had been sitting with the last of the evening light, and he sat across from Louise, who was working on her land rights correspondence, and he said, "I want to tell you something." She put down the letter and looked at him. He had the expression that meant the thought was important. "I have been thinking about the canyon," he said. "The night I made the decision. I have been thinking about it more lately because Thomas has been asking questions about where I came from and what I did before the ranch, and I have been trying to decide what to tell him." "Tell him the truth," she said, which was unsurprising because she was Louise. "The truth is complicated," he said. "The truth is always complicated," she said. "That is not a reason not to tell it." He was quiet for a moment. "I was running for 3 years," he said. "From the law, from myself, from the idea that a person like me could have anything that was worth calling a life. I was 20 years old and I made bad choices, and I kept making them because I did not know that stopping was an option, and then I met you, and you were the first thing I had seen in 3 years that made stopping look like the better direction." "Isaiah," she said. "I am not done," he said. "I want to tell Thomas that his father did things wrong and then found his way to doing things right, because that is the true story, and the true story is more useful than the sanitized one. And I want him to know that the thing that turned the direction was a woman on a dirt road in a rainstorm who introduced herself first because she wanted to set the tone of the conversation, and who told the truth about everything and expected the same in return." Louise looked at him across the table with the lamp between them, the same as the first night, the same quality of light making the familiar face warm and true. "He is going to think that is a very good story," she said. "It is a very good story," Isaiah said. "Tell it to him," she said, "all of it. And then bring him out to see the land and tell him what it took to keep it, because understanding that will matter to him more than the adventure parts." "He is already more interested in the land than the adventure parts," Isaiah said, which was true. Thomas Sheridan at 7 had the relationship with the North Ridge acreage that Louise had had at 25, the bone-deep proprietary attachment of someone who understands instinctively that this particular ground is worth whatever it takes to keep it. "He takes after you," Isaiah said. "He takes after both of us," she said. "Which is the best possible outcome?" He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and they sat like that in the evening quiet of the house on the North Ridge, with the children sleeping and the ranch at rest around them, and the 420 acres outside the window as fully and legally and permanently theirs as anything on this earth can be called anyone's. And the years of it were all there in that moment, every mile of it, from the rainstorm on the road to the cell at dawn to the courtroom to the return. All the way forward to this table, and this lamp, and this life that they had built from the wreckage of a more frightening set of possibilities into something that held. On the wall of the kitchen above the iron cookstove, Louise had framed 2 things. One was the deed to the Garner Sheridan Ranch, North Ridge, Harlan County, Texas, dated in her father's hand and countersigned in hers and later Isaiah's. The other was the receipt from the Harlan County Territorial Bank, dated November 1st, 1878, for the final payment in full on the land note account, paid by order of Isaiah Sheridan, amount $312, source of payment listed as public reward funds, Harlan County Sheriff's account. She had framed the receipt herself, the day after the land note was paid, before she had even ridden into town to see Isaiah in his cell. She had sat at the table with the receipt that Prout had sent over by Hector, and she had read it 3 times, and she had understood what it meant in every direction it pointed, and she had found the frame in the bottom of her father's old trunk where he had kept the things he considered worth keeping, and she had put the receipt in it, and she had hung it on the wall. She had never explained to anyone why it was there, and no one who knew the story needed an explanation. Every person who came into that kitchen saw it and understood, or asked and was told, and the story of what Isaiah Sheridan had done, told by Louise Sheridan with the directness and fullness she brought to every true account, was not a story about an outlaw and his sacrifice. It was a story about a man who had found the thing that was worth more than his freedom, and who had spent his freedom to protect it, and who had discovered, on the other side of that expenditure, that the thing he had protected had been building a door back to him the whole time. The years went on in the good way that years go on when they are filled with the right things. Thomas turned 10, and Isaiah got him the horse he had promised, a steady bay gelding that Thomas named General after no one in particular, and the pride of that ownership made him taller than he had actually grown. Clara at 7 was reading everything she could find and had opinions about all of it, a quality that Louise found entirely familiar and Isaiah found deeply entertaining. Samuel at 5 had the combination of his mother's determination and his father's stillness, and spent long, quiet hours in the barn with Rupert learning the mechanics of things, how gear worked, how rope was tied, how leather was cut, with the patience of a child who intends to understand the world completely before acting in it. In 1891, Louise was asked by the Territorial Land Office in Austin to formally consult on the development of a new set of guidelines for banknote practices on homestead properties, work that she did over 6 months of correspondence and 2 trips to Austin, with Isaiah holding the ranch and the children, and managing it with the competence that had never been in question, though Thomas at 10 felt he was probably old enough to be considered a co-manager of operations, a position his father acknowledged with the gravity it deserved. The guidelines were adopted in 1892, and the Territorial Land Officer wrote to Louise to say that they represented the most practically grounded protection for small landowners that the territory had produced, and that the source of their practical grounding was evident throughout. She read this letter at the kitchen table and then set it down and looked out the window at the North Ridge in the morning light, at the land that was the reason the guidelines existed, and felt the satisfaction of a thing completed in both directions at once, the personal and the larger. That was the year they also replaced the original 2-room house structure with a full 6-room house, built around the original bones, but expanded to match the life that had grown inside it. Isaiah and Rupert and Graham and 2 carpenters from town built it through the spring and summer, and Louise chose the layout with the same methodical intelligence she brought to range management, thinking about how the spaces would work in practice and for the people who were going to live in them. The kitchen remained the center, large and practical, with the iron stove and the big table and the 2 framed things on the wall, which were rehung in their same position in the new kitchen before anything else was placed. Thomas, 12 by then, declared the new house satisfactory with the measured assessment of a boy who is trying very hard to be a man and mostly succeeding. Clara said she liked her room, and then immediately began arranging it with the same decisive efficiency her mother used on every organizational task. Samuel walked through every room and then said he wanted to look at the barn, which had not changed, and spent the afternoon there with the horses in the particular contentment of a child who knows his priorities. By 1895, the Sheridan Ranch employed 4 hands full-time, ran 200 cattle, and had added a small but productive operation in horses that Isaiah managed with the knowledge he had accumulated over 17 years of horses being the primary fact of his working life. Thomas at 14 was working alongside the hands every day after school, not as a supervised activity, but as a participant who was treated as one, and who fulfilled the role with the reliability that made the expectation worthwhile. Clara at 12 had decided she wanted to be a lawyer, influenced by years of watching her mother's land rights work, and by a natural argumentative capability that her parents found easier to channel than to discourage. Samuel at 9 had announced that he was going to be a doctor, which surprised no one who had watched him methodically treat every injured animal on the ranch with the same careful, systematic attention. On the evening of their 16th wedding anniversary, December 1895, Isaiah and Louise sat on the porch in the cold air, wrapped in the good quilt that her mother had made and that had traveled from Missouri with her, the one she saved for cold porches and important evenings. The children were inside, Thomas reading, Clara arguing by letter with a school friend about the suffrage question, Samuel asleep because he had been up before dawn to watch Rupert birth a difficult foal and had used all his energy in careful observation. 16 years, Isaiah said. And you have not bolted once, she said. I have not wanted to, he said, which was the absolute truth. She leaned against him in the dark, which was still, after 16 years, an act she performed with the conscious pleasure of someone who has not always had it to do. What do you think about when you think about the canyon? She asked. He thought for a moment. I think it was the right choice, he said. Not the one I wanted to make, because the one I wanted to make was to stay, but it was the one that made staying possible afterward. You could have found another way, she said. We could have found another way together, I told you that. You did, he said. I believed you meant it. I also knew that every day I was near you, the risk to you grew. And I knew that if I had stayed, eventually something would have happened and the consequence would have fallen on you. She was quiet for a moment. You do not have to explain it to me, she said. I understood it then. I understand it better now. I know, he said. I just want to say it clearly because I have thought about it for 16 years and I want you to know that the reason was you. Not the money, not the guilt, not the surrender. You. I would have stayed forever if staying had been safe for you. And I would do it again, exactly the same, which is a strange thing to say about the worst day of my life. It was not the worst day of your life, she said. No, he agreed. The worst days were the running ones. She took his hand under the quilt, the way she had reached through the cell bars, the same quality of grip, firm and unambiguous. The land is ours, she said. Completely, he said. The children are well, she said. Entirely, he said. And you are here, she said. There is nowhere else I would go, he said, and he meant it in every direction the statement could be taken, the literal and the historical and the forward-looking all at once. The night was cold and clear, and the stars over the North Ridge were as bright as they had been on the canyon night when he had made his decision, when he had sat under that same sky and tried to calculate the cost of every option. He could see, from the porch of the house he had helped build on the land he had helped secure, the long dark shape of the ridge against the stars, and beyond it the nothing of the open country, and it looked different from this side. From this side, it looked like a boundary that kept everything important on the inside of it. He put his arm around his wife, and she settled against him in the familiar way, and the house was warm behind them, and the land was quiet around them, and the night was long and unhurried. And Isaiah Sheridan, who had once been only an outlaw and a wanted name on a poster, thought about who he was now, and found that the answer was simple and complete and entirely sufficient. He was the man who had walked through that door at dawn with his hands raised, and a piece of paper with a woman's land note on it, and had come out the other side of everything that followed into a life that was the most real thing he had ever touched. That was enough. It was, in fact, considerably more than enough. It was everything. The ranch on the North Ridge stood for many more years after that, and was Thomas's eventually, and then his children's, the Sheridan name on the deed as solid and permanent as the ground it was written to. And the story of how it had been kept was told in that family with the fullness and honesty that Louise had always brought to every true account, the story of a man and a woman on a dirt road in a rainstorm, and a cell door at dawn, and a receipt on a wall above an iron stove, and 420 acres of West Texas that had been worth every single thing it had cost.